Love it or hate it, Dove Street is our home. It's a place of strange contrasts, a uniquely ugly place, but with beautiful views across the city. It's home to many people with problems, but also home to many lovable eccentrics and thriving families. It suffers from neglect and poverty, yet it sits within a few streets of the busy centre of town and the affluent streets of Kingsdown. But when I moved to Dove Street, I wondered, why is it here? Why is it so tatty and ugly? And what was here before? So I did some research, and here is my short history of Dove Street. If we were to stand here in medieval times, we see a very different view. Medieval Bristol was much smaller than the Bristol we see today, confined by lands owned by the church within its city walls, which stretched from Nelson Street to the Haymarket in the north. The town was governed and dominated by the huge castle which was in Castle Park, and one of the largest castles in England. To picture Bristol then, think of Game of Thrones but with more mud and cruelty. The castle was home to the royal garrison. The king's cavalry would ride north along the muddy track that led to a wooded hill to exercise their horses on the grassy plateau overlooking Bristol. This became known as the King's Down. Rising to your left, on the slopes beneath Kingsdown Hill, you would see a large dovecot, which gave its name to Dovecot Farm, where pigeons were bred for their eggs. I wonder if the flocks of pigeons that stubbornly roost on the balconies of Dove Street flats today might be the descendants of those medieval rock doves, in which case maybe we should forgive them for their noise and pooping, since they were here first. If you were to walk up the lane known as Nine Tree Hill, you would find 9 elm trees, and nearby a well that was famous for a story of romance, war, tragedy and enduring love. In the darkest days of the English Civil War, when the country was torn apart by conflict, Bristol was braced for an attack by a huge parliamentarian army. On the eve of battle, Captain Pugsley and his young love were married in Bristol Cathedral by torchlight. Captain Pugsley barely had time to kiss his new bride before having to dash up to the defences in Priors Hill Fort, now in Fremantle Square. By the light of huge bonfires, the attackers swarmed the fort, and fierce hand-to-hand fighting lasted deep into the night, when the defenders were all slaughtered. Poor Captain Pugsley was killed and buried nearby in a field next to a well. The young widow was heartbroken, and despite being courted by many suitors, remained faithful to her dead husband, wearing widow's black for the rest of her long life. Pugsley's widow became a much-loved local eccentric, often seen playing and laughing with children who visited the hill. She would offer to bathe people's eyes at the well, which was said to have healing properties. Her dying wish at the age of 80 was that her funeral should be a happy event because she was joining her husband in heaven. 10,000 people came out to follow her funeral procession up to Kingsdown, preceded by a fiddler playing a merry tune and young girls scattering flowers. She was buried next to her husband by the well. Bristolians were very proud of the story of Ma Pugsley, but now her well lies forgotten in a back garden behind Nugent Hill. If you take a short walk to Bristol Museum, you'll find a series of maps which illustrate the growth of Bristol from a small town to a sprawling city. Shortly after the time of Ma Pugsley's story, rich merchants started to build their homes on Kingsdown to avoid the noise and pollution of the city, creating Bristol's first suburb. But prosperity brought a huge expansion, and pretty soon Kingsdown was no longer outside the city, but was decidedly in a city. And when the rich merchants started to move to Clifton for the fresher air, Dove Street and Kingsdown fell into disrepair and became a notorious slum. So, how did the quaint Georgian streets of Dove Street become Dove Street Flats? Here is a very brief history of social housing. In World War I, the army were horrified by the poor physical health of the recruits. Poverty and poor housing had led to a generation blighted by malnutrition and rickets, with poor health and illiteracy. After the Great War, the Liberal government announced a new Homes for Heroes programme of social housing building. Strict building regulations ensured each house would have inside bathrooms and a parlour with enough garden to be able to grow food. If you look at sea mills and fish ponds, these are great examples of this attempt to create new health environments for working families. However, the following Conservative government felt the regulations were too expensive, so they started to make cheaper and more densely packed housing. During the 1930s depression, councils started to build small apartment blocks as a quick solution to a lack of housing. Bristol suffered terribly during the Second World War, where bombing destroyed most of the old city in the centre of town, leaving thousands homeless. People squatted old army bases or lived in ruined houses in desperate need of housing. The post-war Labour government introduced the welfare state, the NHS, and started a rapid social housing programme using new prefabricated concrete techniques to quickly build housing estates. Blocks of high-rise flats were seen as a quick solution to the housing crisis. Modernism was a huge influence in the design of these buildings. People felt that the old world needed to be cleared away to make room for a bright, new, shiny city. Modernism saw functionality as a new aesthetic, turning away from decorative architecture towards a style based on function, a style we now refer to as brutalism. Architects tried to follow the theories of the pioneering architect Le Corbusier, who designed housing blocks as machines for living, seeing blocks as luxury cruise liners with their own shops, nurseries, gyms, and even swimming pools. The reality of budget constraints in post-war UK, though, meant that blocks of flats were built with few facilities, cheap materials, and little space. Dove Street had become a slum by this time, partially cleared by the building of the BRI hospital, so it seemed like an ideal location for a new, exciting form of housing. The opening of Dove Street was very exciting, and people were enthusiastic about living in clean new houses with inside toilets, known as streets in the sky. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher very shrewdly changed the law to allow working-class families to buy their council homes, turning them into homeowners, more likely to vote Conservative. She also made it illegal for local authorities to build new housing, so the country lost 2/3 of its social housing stock. This led to a situation where only the most desperate and needy could get a council home. This, combined with savage cuts to council budgets, changed the character of housing estates from aspirational homes for working families to problem housing for problem people. Council estates became run down and poorly maintained, with all the problems associated with neglect and poverty. Crime, drug use and antisocial behaviour were rampant. This in turn led to social housing being seen as the last resort, and funding for housing estates became less popular, adding to what became known as broken windows syndrome, where cumulative neglect became compounded by crime until council estates became no-go zones to be avoided. So now we see film crews choosing Dove Street as symbolic of inner-city deprivation and neglect, a suitable backdrop for crime, gangs and drug dealers. So I hope this film helps you to understand how Dove Street became how it is. But what about the future? Because Dove Street is made of people, and people working together as a community can make a positive change to create our own future. We can either accept our lot, living in a bleak and uncaring environment, or we can work together to transform the world around us. Broken window syndrome can be replaced by flowering fruit tree syndrome, where the seeds of hope can be seen to grow all around us. So what started as a couple of people transforming a fly-tipping corner has grown into a bigger project, where we are planting fruit trees and getting benches to transform this bleak and unwelcoming park into a community space and a beautiful orchard that we can all enjoy together.